Shabbat shalom. So in January of 1993, I spent a week in Haiti. I was part of a human rights observer delegation. Well, I have to say there weren't a lot of human rights to observe. But I did gain three things out of that trip. The first one, so I was, at the time, I was the Hillel director at American University, and the then president of American University, Joe Duffy, he was an old friend of Bill Clinton's, so he arranged for me to meet President Clinton very briefly. I had 90 seconds. I had a 90-second appointment with him to ask him if he would read our group's findings. Like he said he would. I gave him a copy. Whether he actually read it, I don't know. But so that was the first thing. I got to meet Bill Clinton. The second thing, I was able to honestly say, I have been to Haiti. And the cool thing about that is that in Hebrew, I have been to Haiti is Haiti beHaiti. Okay, Haiti means I was, been in, and then Haiti is how you say Haiti. Okay, so it's almost worth going to Haiti just for that, so that you can honestly say Haiti beHaiti. Okay, but the third thing is I really came to understand a key biblical concept, okay? That is, you find this throughout the Bible, a concern for ger, yatom, va'amana. The ger means the stranger, or you could also quite legitimately translate it as the immigrant or the refugee. Okay, but we are supposed to have special concern for the ger. The yatom is the orphan, but specifically the fatherless, the person who has lost their father, and the almana, the widow. Okay, and throughout the Bible, the Tanakh, the leader, but not only the leader, every Israelite is supposed to have a special regard for the ger, yatom, va'almanah, and that if we don't treat them fairly, God will step in. Okay, and I understood that in Haiti, because Haiti, I mean, when we were going there, I thought, little dicey, I'm going to a dictatorship. Much dicier than that. It wasn't a dictatorship. It was a country without government entirely. Okay, a country without government entirely. And so we have a situation that the Bible also describes as not a good situation. Ish hayashah be'enav ya'aseh. Right? Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. Right? So if you didn't have, the strong guy, the starker, I mean, I guess they didn't, not too many Haitians speak Yiddish, right? But the starker to take care of you, then you were in trouble, right? But, or you could pay some, rent a starker to take care of you, but most people could not begin to afford something like that. And that's why the situation is so bad, because it was just chaos, and all of the warlords did whatever they wanted, right? But in the Bible, right, you have extended families is the system of organization, right? So the ger, the yatom, and the almanah they have nobody to look after them, right? The Ger, because they're not part of any clan at all, they're not even part of the people, right? The Yatom, because their father is no longer on the scene, so there's nobody to protect them. And the Almanah, the widow, her husband is no longer on the scene, so there's nobody to protect her. So the Bible says, no, don't think that they're fair game, because God will take care of them, right? And we have in the Bible, a lot of times we read about shepherds, right? And we say, oh, the shepherds, the fun thing, and you get to, wear a robe and sandals and play a flute, and it's very relaxing and pastoral. It's not at all. Like, being a shepherd is tough work, and it's nasty work, and you got to protect the sheep from the predators, from the animal predators, and from the human predators, right? And that's why we have in the 23rd Psalm, right? Adonai is my shepherd, right? Adonai is my shepherd because the shepherd is the one who takes care. And the king is often referred to as the shepherd of Israel. But that's also a metaphor, not only in the Bible, but throughout the ancient Near Eastern texts, okay? And here, I have to tell you, I do not read Ugaritic. I do not read Babylonian, but I read secondary literature, right? And you can learn a lot about the similarities and differences between ancient Israel and other ancient Near Eastern society, right? So if you look at the Code of Hammurabi from Babylonia, right, which is one of the ancient texts that we have, right? I think the original is in the Louvre, I believe. And there's a replica at the Semitic Museum in Harvard, which I have seen, although I can't read it. But then Hammurabi says, I am Hammurabi the shepherd, appointed by the god Enlil. I am Hammurabi, king of justice, to whom the god Shamash has granted insight into the truth. And we find Psalm 72, which is not a psalm that we're necessarily that familiar, doesn't appear that much in the liturgy, but this is a royal coronation psalm. It says, O God, grant the king your judgments, the king's son your righteousness. Right, and then a couple of verses later, we learn that the primary obligation of the king is to administer justice, right? Psalm 72, verse 4, may he, that is the king, may he defend the cause of the poor of the people, give deliverance to the needy, and crush the oppressor, right? And then we have in the Code of Hammurabi, he says that the god Marduk commissioned him to eliminate evil and the evildoer so that the strong might not oppress the weak, to rise like Shamash over the mortals, and to light up the land. Okay, and then in a text from Ugarit, which is in Syria, the Ugaritic text, Prince Yasib rebukes his dying father, Kirta. And Prince Yasib says to his father, King Kirta, you've let your hands fall to vice. You don't pursue the widow's case. You don't take up the wretched person's claim. You don't expel the poor person's oppressor. In other words, Dad, you've been a crummy king, right? Because the primary role of king is to execute justice, especially for the poor and the weak. And you haven't done that. Instead, you've used kingship to enrich yourself. Okay, and the Ugaritic text somehow, for some reason, thinks this is a bad thing. It's a bad thing for the king to enrich himself rather than execute judgment on behalf of the poor and the immigrant, right? And we might think superficially, right? Because spoke about the parasha, tzedek tirdov, justice shall you pursue, that this model of the king being responsible for justice would be a good thing, right? But interesting article I read this week by Professor Bernard Levinson of the University of Minnesota, and he says that Deuteronomy actually rejects this model. Okay, it's a really interesting argument. And Levinson isn't saying that execution of justice isn't important, right? Tzedek tirdov, right? Justice shall you pursue, and all of these laws in the Parsha about how we implement justice. But in Deuteronomy, whose job is it? It's not the job of the king. It is the job of an independent judiciary. The king in Deuteronomy is a constitutional monarch with severe limitations placed upon him, right? And the judges are professionals. They're not just elders, and they're not hereditary officials, right? I mean, the first sentence of this parasha, which we did not read because we're in year 3, but the first sentence of this parasha, Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha b'chol sha'arecha. You shall appoint judges and judicial officers in each of your city gates. V'shaftu et ha'am mishpat tzedek, and they shall judge the people with righteous justice, right? In other words, that commandment is not addressed to the king. It's addressed to the entire populace, right? The judges are appointed by the people as a whole, not by the king. And where do they sit? In each of the city gates. Okay, say, well, of course they're good, right? But it's not obvious, right? Because one of the key concerns of Deuteronomy is the centralization of the sanctuary, right? It's all about, you're not allowed to have these local altars, right? Everything is in Jerusalem, right? And now it's very, very clear that that wasn't followed until much later, right? If we look at the book of Samuel and the book of Judges, right, which is supposedly after, right, the Torah has been given, but they still have local altars, right? And at each local altar, that's also where you go for judgment. And who are the judges? The elders of the city, right? But in Deuteronomy, the judges are professional judges, not the elders of the city, and they are appointed by and accountable to the people as a whole. but it's decentralized. They're everywhere. They're in every city gate, right? And now, of course, I said that the judges, this commandment to appoint judges is not addressed to a king. Why? Because there's not a king yet, right? Deuteronomy says if you want to appoint a king, you may. Right? Deuteronomy allows the appointment of a king, but it doesn't really want the appointment of a king, right? And that there is continuity, right? When much later people go to Samuel and they say, appoint the king, and he's very reluctant, right? But the people force him, and Saul is appointed, but Samuel makes it very clear that in appointing a human king, this is rebellion against God, right? But the king has limits to their power, and the king also has no role in the judiciary. The king is not a judge, right? And the king is not above the law, right? As the king is in Europe centuries later, right? Right in Deuteronomy, we have the rule that if you have a king, he may not amass for himself many wives, right? And he may not amass horses, and he must not send the people back to Egypt to get horses, right? And the king must not amass too much gold or silver. It's all in the book of Deuteronomy. And interestingly, Professor Levinson points out that in the book of Deuteronomy, there is only, one, all right, so there are 5 prohibitions that the king cannot do. There's only one affirmative obligation that the king must perform in the book of Deuteronomy. One affirmative obligation is the only thing that Deuteronomy says the king must do. What is it? Anybody know? Write a copy of the Torah, keep it with him, and read from it at all times, right? That is the only affirmative obligation of the king in Deuteronomy. Right now, the idea that officials are accountable to the law, right? That didn't originate in Deuteronomy, right? The Code of Hammurabi, we also find that the judges are accountable to the law, but the judges are accountable, and if they don't fulfill their rule properly, the king punishes them, right? The king in the Code of Hammurabi is not subject to the law. The king establishes the law, and the king appoints the judges, right? But in Deuteronomy, that order is precisely opposite, right? The law allows the people to appoint a king, therefore the law precedes the king, right? The king does not precede the law precedes the king. The institution of kingship is created by the law. The law is not created by the king, right? And Professor Levinson says that the Torah serves as a draft constitution. It's really interesting, right? That in Deuteronomy, there are 3 branches, right? Now, it's not legislative, executive, and judicial, right? It's king, Kohanim, and judges, right? But there are still three branches, and each of these branches is created by a single sovereign text, right? And therefore accountable to its text. Each of the three branches has its own sphere of responsibility, and no branch is higher than any other, right? And this is really interesting, right? I mean, what is the text? It's the Torah, right? And in America, what is the text? The Constitution, right? And it's the Constitution that creates the presidency. It's the Constitution that creates Congress. It's the Constitution that creates the judiciary, right? And that's why, I mean, I don't know, anybody besides me ever taken an oath of office? Right? Yeah, okay. Who do you, when you take, I was the ethics commission chair, I took the oath of office, right? You take the oath of office, who do you swear loyalty? The Constitution, right? I will bear, whatever the word may differ, I will bear true faith to the Constitution, or I protect and defend the Constitution, right? As an officer of the United States, or the state of Maryland, or a county or a city, right? You are accountable to the Constitution. Not the president, not the governor, not the mayor, the Constitution, right? And similarly, in Deuteronomy, the judges are accountable not to the king, they're accountable to the Torah, right? And so Levinson says this anticipates the US Constitution in two specific ways. One is separation of powers, right? Each branch of government has its own sphere of authority, and the other two branches are not allowed to claim superiority or authority over the other branches, right? And all of them are subject to the rule of law, including the monarch, right? And all of these principles are grounded in the notion of an independent judiciary, right? It's only when the judiciary stands on equal ground with the monarchy, as it does in Deuteronomy, that it's possible to protect the judiciary from the monarchy, or in more modern language, to ensure the autonomy of the judicial branch in relation to the executive, right? And an independent judiciary is really the foundation of our freedoms, right? If we don't have an independent judiciary, then we have no freedom. We don't have an independent judiciary, we have no freedom, right? And if you look and, right, I mean, I have been very, very involved in the case of Pilmar Abrego Garcia. I got up at 4 o'clock Monday morning to go to Baltimore, and they asked clergy to go, and so, so if you're on Facebook particularly, right, my face was plastered all over the media this week. CNN, Fox News, Univision, NBC, Reuters, everywhere, right now. You know, everybody has like one thing, the phrase is "Mishu Dollar Dabba," right? You are crazy about this particular thing, right? And for me, why? Okay, because when he was arrested, right, and the administration said it was not arrested, but it was a mistake to send him to El Salvador, right? We acknowledge that there was a court order specifically saying we cannot do that, and we did that, and it was an accident, and we're sorry. But there's nothing we can do about it, right? The courts have no authority because he's in El Salvador. For American courts only have jurisdiction in America. And once you're in another country, no more jurisdiction. Right? And he's Salvador Town, there's nothing we can do. Right? Okay, now, you know what? Maybe he's a bad guy. I don't know. I mean, there are all kinds of accusations. There's not been any trial. There are all kinds of accusations. Maybe he's a bad guy, right? But that's not the point, right? You have to understand the point. If the king says, once I have arrested you and sent you out of the country, even by mistake, there's nothing that can be done. The courts cannot interfere because the courts no longer have jurisdiction. None of us are safe. None of us are safe, right? Because they can do it to you, right? Jeff, you know, they're not happy that you and your fellow employees, ex-employees, once and future employees of VOA, right? You're going to court and all these annoying things that you're doing. Well, we'll ship you to El Salvador. Okay. We probably shouldn't have done that, but now the court has no say. Because he's not in the United States anymore, right? If they can do it to him, they can do it to you, right? And if they can do it to you, they can do it to me because they don't like my stuff, right? I mean, this is one, right? It's not about him. It's really not about him. It's about all of us. And if we don't have an independent judiciary, we don't have freedom. And this idea, I'm not getting this from the pages of the New Republic, right? I'm getting this from the pages of the Book of Deuteronomy. It is as old as that, and the king is not above the law, and the judiciary must be independent. And if the king is above the law and the judiciary is not independent, we don't have freedom, we don't have justice, and we're not living the way God wants us to live. Shabbat shalom.
Can you turn off the?
Yeah.